We're terminating you effective immediately. Security will escort you out, he said, without even looking up from his brand new company-issued laptop, still halfway through logging into his Slack account for the first time. The CEO's son. Day 1, hour 1. Me. My name is Austin Caldwell, and I'm 48 years old. I've spent the last 26 years of my life building Apex Industrial Solutions, from a two-man operation in a rented warehouse to a $750 million manufacturing powerhouse. And this entitled kid just tried to fire me. No handshake, no explanation. Just a trembling HR director standing behind him like she was watching someone defuse a bomb with a paperclip. The ink on his onboarding packet was still wet, and he was already playing executioner. Bryce Ashford had his hair slicked back with enough product to waterproof a deck, his resume printed on thick cream cardstock, and his Stanford MBA confidence inflated like a bounce house at a bankruptcy auction. He didn't ask questions. He didn't even blink. Just read the line off his iPad, word for word. You could tell someone coached him, probably his girlfriend Madison, who'd been posting Instagram stories all week about my boyfriend's executive promotion with hashtags like #PowerCouple and #NextLevelLife. The pressure from his social circle was obvious. They expected him to make waves, prove he deserved the corner office. I didn't flinch or argue. I stood up, adjusted my jacket, and handed over my badge with the kind of grace you learn after 26 years of swallowing power plays and grinding through boardroom politics. He thought he was firing me. Thought this was his first big move, his chance to impress Daddy and his trust fund friends. All I said was, I want to do this right. Tell your father the board meeting in 3 hours should be interesting. Then I walked out, past Linda Cross, our HR director, who looked mortified by what she'd just witnessed, past the security guard who seemed more confused than concerned, past the framed photo of the founding team in the lobby. That photo, funny enough, included the guy who actually wrote the bylaws they built their entire empire on. Me. And hey, while I've got you here, if this already feels like the kind of corporate chaos that makes your jaw drop, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and give it a like. Not because I'm begging, but because it really helps the team keep unearthing these stories and exposing what really happens behind those glass doors. You'd be surprised how often the person getting fired is the one holding the leash. Now back to our regularly scheduled downfall. Let me tell you what those 26 years really cost me. While Bryce was figuring out which fraternity to pledge and which trust fund to tap, I was pulling 80-hour weeks designing manufacturing processes that would revolutionize industrial automation. I missed my daughter's high school graduation because we were finalizing the Patterson Steel contract. I missed my father's funeral because the EPA was breathing down our necks over compliance issues that only I knew how to handle. My ex-wife Sarah used to joke that I was married to Apex before I married her. She wasn't wrong. The joke stopped being funny around year 12 when she filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences with a workaholic. What she meant was, I chose building something lasting over building a comfortable suburban life. I chose equity over salary. I chose late nights in the factory over early dinners at home. I chose to understand every bolt, every process, every regulatory requirement that kept our operation running. While other executives played golf and networked at country clubs, I was on the factory floor, learning how our automated welding systems actually functioned. That knowledge wasn't just professional, it was personal. I held patents for 3 manufacturing processes that were now industry standard. I built vendor relationships across 15 countries. When our biggest competitor tried to poach our clients in 2018, they couldn't replicate what we did because they didn't understand how we did it. I did. 3 hours. That's how long Bryce had between his first firing and his first legal disaster. In that time, I imagine he celebrated. Maybe popped a little champagne in his corner office. My old office, if we're being precise. Maybe drafted up a chipper little LinkedIn post about decisive leadership and tough calls. Hell, he probably already had the hashtags queued up with Madison's help. #leadership, #innovation, #disruptor, or whatever buzzword his personal brand consultant told him would trend. Meanwhile, the board packet had already gone out. Clause 17C, titled Plainly Emergency Reassignment and Voting Suspension Trigger, buried in the original shareholder agreement like a landmine nobody expected to step on. Written by yours truly, reviewed by Patricia Wells. Our general counsel, signed by every investor who ever asked the smart question, but what happens if leadership goes rogue? The answer? If an executive is terminated without a formal board vote and that termination is initiated by an appointee with no equity, then the appointee loses all interim authority. The board convenes within the day. Voting power reverts to the majority shareholder, me. Because while he was probably sipping bubbly and measuring for new curtains, I was filing that clause activation, dated, signed, time-stamped at 7:03 a.m., and couriered to every board member, investor, and general counsel tied to this company. Unlike his welcome packet, mine came with certified return receipts and legal weight that could crush a Ferrari. He thought I'd go quietly, maybe update my LinkedIn to seeking new opportunities like some displaced middle manager. What he didn't know was that I never built this company to be seen. I built it to be safe from people exactly like him. Entitled, impatient, handed power like it came with the family name and trust fund access. He wasn't the first to underestimate me, but he might just be the last. Because by the time his celebratory Instagram story got halfway drafted, his name had already been flagged in the system. Unrecognized executive, no voting rights, pending shareholder review. And Ronald Ashford, his father, still hadn't seen the packet. But he would. Oh, he would. There's a reason my name doesn't appear in the glossy company brochures or on the About Us page that Bryce probably studied before his first day. I was the shadow in the scaffolding, the clause in the contract, the call you made when the boardroom lights were off and the SEC was circling like hawks. I never wanted the spotlight or the magazine covers. I wanted structure, stability, leverage, and equity. God, the equity. While they were naming conference rooms after Ronald's grandkids and handing out plaques to people who'd been here 5 fiscal quarters, I was taking payment in percentages. Half a point here, a full point there. Equity, not bonuses. Voting shares, not titles. Every time a deal closed or an investor came sniffing around our compound growth, I negotiated another sliver. Quietly, efficiently, like a master craftsman building something that would last generations. I didn't play poker with company politics. I built the table and printed the cards. It started back when Apex was 2 folding chairs, a whiteboard covered in engineering sketches, and a founder who thought OSHA compliance was optional paperwork. Ronald Ashford was a visionary, sure, the kind who could see market gaps that others missed, but couldn't remember if we'd paid our vendors or accidentally sent 6 figures to the contractor who painted our break room. I stepped in during year 2. Streamlined operations, stabilized cash flow, secured our first major manufacturing contracts that turned us from a garage operation into a legitimate industrial player. For my trouble, Ronald offered me a VP title and a corner office. I declined, asked for stock instead. "You'd rather own the ceiling than sit under it," he joked, not realizing he'd just described my entire business philosophy. "Exactly," I said. Titles change. Ownership doesn't. By year 3, I was sitting on 18%. Not through manipulation or backdoor deals, but through documented value creation that even our auditors applauded. By year 8, I held 41%. Every percentage point earned through late nights solving problems that would have bankrupted smaller companies. The real breakthrough came in year 15 when our CFO, James Fletcher's predecessor, left in a screaming match over what he called misallocated funds. What he really meant was he got caught skimming consultant fees into his personal account. When the smoke cleared, he needed cash fast to avoid criminal charges. I picked up his 14% stake at 60 cents on the dollar. He needed the money. Federal investigations are expensive, and his legal team wasn't working for free. The final piece came 3 years later when Ronald's brother tried to sue us into oblivion over some alleged patent infringement that never existed. Thomas Ashford was bitter that he'd sold his initial stake for $200,000 back when the company was worth maybe $2 million. When we hit $500 million valuation, his regret turned into a frivolous lawsuit claiming intellectual property theft. The case was garbage, and we both knew it. But litigation is expensive, time-consuming, and damaging to client relationships. After 18 months of legal warfare that cost us both more than the disputed amount, Thomas offered to settle privately. I took his remaining 17.3% stake in exchange for a bulletproof NDA and his promise to never contact another Ashford family member about business again. 72.3%. That's where I sat by year 23, quietly. No fanfare, no parades, no press releases. Just majority ownership, neatly filed in the Delaware corporate registry where smart lawyers look and dumb executives don't. And nestled inside that ownership structure was Clause 17C, a weird little appendix section that nobody ever bothered to read because we'd never needed it. The clause stated that if a non-equity executive ever terminated a corporate officer without a formal board vote, all executive powers would be suspended pending emergency shareholder review. It was a clause born from necessity, written during a particularly ugly incident 8 years ago when Ronald's nephew tried to fire our entire marketing department during what I can only describe as a cocaine-fueled tantrum. Kid thought having the Ashford name meant having Ashford authority. I watched his LinkedIn profile go dark within 48 hours and his trust fund access get suspended indefinitely. That was the last time anyone in the extended family touched power they didn't earn through actual contribution. Until now. Because what Bryce didn't understand, what apparently nobody taught him during his $200,000 Stanford MBA program, was that inheriting a job title doesn't mean inheriting actual control. Control isn't gifted or granted or handed down like a family heirloom. It's not in your last name or printed on your business cards or displayed on your office door. Real control lives in the contracts, buried in the fine print, encoded in clauses written during 2 a.m. conference calls with paranoid investors who asked uncomfortable questions like, what happens if the founder's kid turns out to be an idiot? Turns out it activates exactly like this. One arrogant termination, no board vote, no documented cause, no proper process. Just a spoiled 29-year-old with fresh teeth whitening and a new email signature strutting into my office like he was directing his own reboot of Succession. He had no clue that by reading that termination script off his iPad, he'd triggered a corporate trapdoor that had been bolted shut for 17 years, just waiting for someone entitled enough and stupid enough to step on it. Now that clause was live, breathing, and about to devour everything he thought he controlled. I didn't just send the activation letter. I sent a full legal arsenal, shareholder statements, equity breakdown going back 26 years, archived email approvals, timestamped documents, notarized copies of every transaction that built my majority position. I even included Bryce's little termination memo signed with his inexperienced flourish and dated that morning, complete with its grammatical errors and Linda Cross's reluctant HR cosign. They'd laugh about those typos later. Well, someone would. Because while he was probably figuring out how to order office plants and get his executive parking spot upgraded, the board members were opening a very different kind of delivery, sealed in fireproof FedEx envelopes stamped confidential, Clause 17-C, activation. The courier had arrived at exactly 9:15 a.m., handed the packets to executive assistants like they were jury summons, and left without small talk. Inside each packet was a 3-inch thick stack of corporate hell, cover page, Clause 17C activation. Shareholder transition proposal. Subheading, request for immediate emergency board meeting under Bylaw 8.4. The kind of legal language that makes seasoned executives reach for antacids and their personal attorneys. Attached was my signed trigger letter, time-stamped at 7:03 a.m., hours before Bryce ever walked into my office with his termination theater. Also included, complete equity documentation showing every share I'd acquired, every transaction validated, every co-signed agreement that built my 72.3% majority position over more than 2 decades of strategic patience. The reaction wasn't instant. It was worse. It was the slow, creeping realization that spreads through a boardroom like carbon monoxide. Invisible, deadly, and absolutely unstoppable once it's in the air. By the time Patricia Wells, our general counsel, skimmed past the corporate formalities and hit the operative phrase, suspension of executive authority upon unilateral termination by non-equity appointee, she actually said out loud to her empty office, "Oh no," and then again, quieter, like a prayer to a god who'd stopped listening, "Oh no." The packet also included a meeting mandate that nobody could ignore. The board was legally required to convene within 3 hours of clause activation. That timer had already started ticking the moment I filed the documentation. I didn't need to be in the building. The law was, the contracts were, and they were all on my side. Meanwhile, Ronald Ashford was mid-back swing on hole 7 at the Dallas Country Club he'd half-funded through corporate sponsorships, chewing a Cuban cigar that matched both his tan and his oversized ego. The first call came in during his approach shot. Ignored. The second one interrupted his putt, also ignored. It wasn't until the third ring, persistent, sharp, from Patricia's personal cell phone that never called unless someone was getting indicted, that he grunted, dropped his putter, and snapped into the phone. "This better involve blood or bankruptcy," he barked. What followed was neither, but somehow worse than both. "I need you back at headquarters immediately," Patricia's voice came through ice-cold professional panic. "Your son signed something. We have a Clause 17C situation." Ronald froze mid-stride. In 23 years of running Apex Industrial Solutions, he'd never heard those words spoken in sequence. Clause 17C was theoretical, a legal boogeyman designed to prevent exactly the kind of scenario that apparently just happened. "What do you mean he signed something?" Ronald's voice dropped to a whisper that his golf partners couldn't hear. "He terminated Austin Caldwell. Alone. Without board approval. Without cause documentation. Without authority." The silence stretched for 10 seconds before Ronald spoke again. "Jesus Christ. How bad? Emergency board meeting in 2 hours. Austin's documentation is ironclad. Ronald, he owns 72.3% of the company. Majority shareholder voting control reverts to him automatically. Ronald didn't finish his round, didn't tip his caddy, didn't even change out of his golf cleats. Just stormed to his Escalade and broke multiple traffic laws getting back to downtown Dallas in under 20 minutes. An Olympic record for someone who usually required 2 assistants and a detailed itinerary just to find his own office. When he arrived, his executive team was already assembled in the smaller conference room, looking like survivors of a corporate plane crash. Patricia Wells sat with legal documents spread across the mahogany table like tarot cards predicting disaster. James Fletcher, our current CFO, stared at his laptop screen showing real-time equity calculations. Linda Cross from HR held a tissue box and looked like she'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. Patricia didn't waste time on pleasantries. She opened her leather folder, took a deep breath that seemed to draw oxygen from the entire room, and read, "Per Clause 17C, amended shareholder agreement dated March 15, 2018, any executive termination carried out by a non-equity appointee without prior board vote shall result in immediate revocation of all interim leadership authority, suspension of executive appointments made within the past 48 hours, and automatic deferment of executive control to the majority shareholder pending emergency board review." Ronald's face went through several color changes, settling on a shade that matched expired milk. "Where's Bryce now?" "Executive dining room," James Fletcher answered quietly. "He's celebrating. Ordered champagne. Posted something on LinkedIn about streamlining operations for maximum efficiency." The room went silent except for the hum of the HVAC system and Patricia's fingers drumming against the legal folder. "How long do we have?" Ronald asked, his voice barely audible. Patricia checked her watch. 73 minutes until the mandatory board meeting begins. Austin will be here, and when he walks in, he won't just be an employee seeking justice. He'll be the majority shareholder, taking control of his company. The weight of those words settled over the room like a burial shroud. For the first time in his career, Ronald Ashford realized he'd just lost a war he didn't know he was fighting. At exactly 2:59 p.m., the boardroom door handle turned. Slow, deliberate, like the hand of a clock marking midnight. You could feel the room tense like a live wire about to snap. Nobody spoke. Even Bryce, who'd been summoned from his champagne celebration looking confused and slightly drunk, stopped fidgeting with his Mont Blanc pen. I walked in at 3:00 p.m. on the dot. No rush, no fanfare. I wore the same charcoal business suit they'd seen me in for countless quarterly reviews, tailored like a second skin but nothing flashy. The kind of presence that didn't need introduction, explanation, or permission. I didn't smile, didn't nod, didn't acknowledge anyone's existence. I walked straight to the head of the table, the seat Ronald hadn't dared occupy since Patricia's legal brief landed like a nuclear bomb, and placed my leather portfolio exactly where it belonged. I didn't sit immediately. I opened the folder with surgical precision and read, my voice carrying the weight of 26 years of preparation. As majority shareholder holding 72.3% of Apex Industrial Solutions, I formally request a binding vote to rescind all executive appointments made within the past 48 hours, pending comprehensive shareholder review and corporate restructuring. The words hit the room like artillery shells. No gasps, no dramatic reactions, just the suffocating silence of people watching their careers evaporate in real time. Board Chair William Morrison, a 70-year-old industry veteran who'd seen hostile takeovers and corporate coups, cleared his throat like he was announcing a death in the family. Motion received, logged, and entered into corporate record for immediate consideration. Still, nobody moved. Ronald sat hunched over like someone had physically removed his spine. The confident patriarch who used to dominate these meetings now looked like a broken marionette whose strings had been cut by his own son's stupidity. Bryce's face had gone through several color changes, finally settling on a shade that matched hospital walls. His mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air, but no words came out. His hands, so steady hours earlier when signing termination papers with authority he'd never possessed, now shook around the edges of his legal pad. I finally sat down, not because I needed permission, but because I owned the chair, the table, the room, and every person sitting in it. Patricia Wells confirmed the procedural requirements. Clause 17C empowers majority shareholder authority to override all interim executive decisions pending board verification. Legal review confirms Mr. Caldwell's documentation is comprehensive and binding. A formal vote may proceed immediately. William Morrison nodded gravely. All in favor of rescinding executive. Appointments pending shareholder review? 9 hands rose. 2 abstained. Both Ashford family friends who couldn't bring themselves to vote but also couldn't oppose legal reality. The motion carried with corporate finality that felt like a judge's gavel. Bryce Ashford, your appointment as Chief Innovation Officer is hereby revoked effective immediately. Security will escort you from the premises. Morrison's voice carried no emotion, just procedural necessity. Bryce finally found his voice. You can't do this. My father built this company. This is our family's legacy. I spoke for the first time since calling the vote, my tone calm as morning coffee. Your father built a framework. I built the company. There's a difference. Ronald finally looked up, his eyes red-rimmed with the kind of exhaustion that comes from watching your mistakes destroy everything you thought you controlled. Austin, what do you want? I slid 2 documents across the polished mahogany. No theatrics, just business. Left page, complete buyout offer. Purchase my 72.3% stake at fair market valuation. You keep the name, the building, whatever's left after I walk away. He stared at the numbers like they were written in Sanskrit. Right page, corporate restructuring under my majority control. You retain 18.2% as founder emeritus. Bryce gets nothing. Merit-based leadership replaces nepotism immediately. The room held its breath while Ronald read both options. His hands trembled as he realized he was choosing between losing his company and losing his son's position in it. After what felt like an hour but was probably 90 seconds, he picked up the restructuring document and signed it with the defeated flourish of someone surrendering a war. Bryce, I said, not unkindly, security is waiting outside. Your personal effects will be shipped. As they escorted him out, he turned back one last time. This isn't over. I met his eyes without blinking. Yes, it is. 6 months later, Apex Industrial Solutions was featured on the cover of Manufacturing Today magazine. The article titled Leadership Renaissance, How Experience Trumped Entitlement detailed our 23% productivity increase, expanded client base, and industry-leading safety record. I kept the magazine cover framed in my office, not out of ego, but as a reminder that real power doesn't announce itself with champagne and LinkedIn posts. It shows up in quarterly reports, employee satisfaction surveys, and competitors trying to headhunt your team because they can't replicate what you've built. Ronald stayed on as founder emeritus, focusing on industry relationships and strategic partnerships. He never spoke about Bryce publicly, though I heard through industry contacts that his son was now selling cryptocurrency advisory services to other trust fund kids. Some people asked if I felt bad about destroying a family legacy. I always gave the same answer. I didn't destroy anything. I protected what I'd spent 26 years building from people who confused inheritance with competence. The building still bears the Ashford name on the lobby wall, but everyone who matters knows who really owns it. And every morning when I walk past that founder's photo in the lobby, I'm reminded of the most important lesson in business. Titles are temporary, but ownership is forever. Sometimes power isn't loud. It's patient, strategic, and impossible to fire. Ooh.